Yes. So pull up.
We're going to call this meeting to order. And we're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if we could please rise. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Righty. Okay, if we can please have the roll call.
Vice President Estrada,
Here.
Secretary Dockstader. Here. Treasurer Gutierrez. Director Plancarte. Director Kelly. Director Tortes.
Here.
Director Aguilar.
Here.
Director Cardenas. Director Perez.
Here.
Ex officio Samantha Arthur.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. With that, we're going to move on to public comments. This public comment time is reserved for comments on matters that are not action items or that are not on the agenda. You are invited to speak to any specific action item listed in the agenda at the time it is called. Is there anybody who would like to make public comments?
Could I interrupt for just a second? I do believe Alex Cardenas is present.
Okay, yes, let's make sure we note that Director Cardenas is here. So is there anybody on Zoom that would like to make public comments?
Just want to let you know that Plancarte is online.
Yes, we will make note that Supervisor Plancarte is also in attendance. Not seeing any public comments, we're going to move on to board member comments. Is there anybody on the board that would like to make comment? Not seeing any, I'm going to move on to consent calendar. Is there any items that the board would like to pull or a motion to approve the consent calendar?
Mr. Vice President, I had a quick question for Patrick. I noticed in the financial report that one of the line items, which was I think it was grant or funds received, we'd only receive like 2% of that amount. And I'm assuming that's a timing issue because we're waiting for the grant to convert. Is that correct?
That's always a timing issue, especially with a budget that's for a full year, and getting that exactly right has always been a challenge. The good news is it's in and out, so it doesn't really have a significant P&L effect. Okay,
great, thank you. Then I'll make the motion to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
There's a motion by Director Aguilar, second by Supervisor Perez. Can we have a roll call, please?
Vice President Estrada,
Yes.
Secretary Dockstader,
Aye.
Treasurer Gutierrez, Director Plancarte,
Plancarte, yes.
Director Kelly, Director Tortes,
Aye.
Director Aguilar,
Yes.
Director Cardenas,
Yes.
Director Perez,
Yes.
ex officio Samantha Arthur. Motion passed.
Thank you. Moving on to item B, monitoring and public health. I believe we have a presentation.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, for some months now, the authority has been discussing the concerns that have been raised for many years about risks to public health and safety as a result of changes taking place at the sea. And we have been working and discussing with various entities, individuals, and universities about how we might pursue a framework that would provide the community and our residents with assurance that those changes are not causing or increasing their health. couple months back, I was able to attend and participate in a Water Education Foundation tour of the Eastern Sierras. Director Dockstader was on the tour with me also. And along the way, we were able to visit Owens Lake and look at the work that's been done there. And we had a chance to meet with Mr. Phil Kiddu, who is the Air Pollution Control Officer for Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District. Mr. Kiddu drove all the way down from Bishop today and has agreed to join us to present some of the work that they've been doing at Owens Lake. And so I'd like to invite up Mr. Kiddu to share his presentation with us.
Ross, could you bring up the PowerPoint, please?
Good morning, Board of Directors. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Owens Lake has a long history, and I think we have some important information to share that can be very beneficial to this board. All right, back to the title slide. So I come here today as a representative of the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District. I've worked for Great Basin. I'm on my 19th year. I've worked various positions through the agency. And I always feel that it's quite important to start a presentation with a little bit of humility. So what really is important about this slide is the Air District in its entirety, because the work you're going to hear about today is based on the shoulders of my predecessors, the shoulders of the giants who we stand on. It also, credit should be due to our stakeholders, participants, collaborators, and partners at the state level, California Air Resources Board, partners at the Environmental Protection of Air Quality, and also partners of the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, who is the responsible agency for controlling the emissions at Owens Lake. Great Basin is the air regulator. We have the authorities of similar to South Coast Air Quality Management District and Imperial.
Well, if you could move your mic just a little closer.
There we go. So this is where we're going to start. In 1913, the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power diverted the entirety of all the water incoming of all the tributaries into Owens Lake and diverted that 223 miles south to the City of Los Angeles. This was a project that was supported at the presidential levels in the United States in the day for the greater good. This was Owens Lake taken in 1891. The shoreline looking towards the Sierras from near the community of Keeler looks actually quite similar to what the Salton Sea looks like today. This is prior to the construction of the aqueduct. Owens Lake is a 110 square mile lake bed, so it is roughly a third the size of the Salton Sea. It sits at an elevation of 3,600 and geographically is sandwiched in between the Inyo White Mountains and the Sierra Nevada crest, which is the rain shadow side, very similar to the Salton Sea here in Southern California. So long story short, after the diversion of water from Owens Lake, it began to dry. And without any inflow, the lake became desiccated. And the entire area of the lake, other than the brine pool, which was the remnant lake, which will always be there as far as we know, became emissive. It became emissive in any wind event that had, elevated wind component from the prevailing wind directions north and south, and sometimes some of the stronger wind directions from the west. This is a PM10 wind event in 2010. And what's important to understand about the air pollution from these dried lake beds is two things: the frequency of the public health impacts and the magnitude of the public health impacts. So at Owens Lake, we had days that exceeded the national ambient air quality standard by over 100 times. So that air quality standard is 150 micrograms per cubic meter per day for PM10. At Owens Lake, we saw concentrations up to 20,000 in a given day. So it's over 100 times the standard. And to put that into perspective, it's like driving down the I-10 with a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit and getting pulled over, doing over 7,000 miles an hour. So where we were at and where we needed to get to protect public health was quite significant. The frequency of these events varied from a dozen to 2 dozen to almost 3 dozen days a year. So Great Basin's authority comes from the Clean Air Act. This is a federal Clean Air Act, the state, and then also local authority. In addition, To the Clean Air Act authorities, we have an additional provision under California Health and Safety Code, and this is Health and Safety Code 42316. And 42316 allows Great Basin to require the city of Los Angeles to mitigate air quality impacts of its water production, storage, and diversions conveyance, and then the fees also associated with our program. So our program to control the air emissions and require controls of emissions at Owens Lake is funded entirely 100% by the city of Los Angeles. We call this the original bargain, and it's not going to read through this text, but it is to control the air contaminants, the air pollution caused by the city's water diversions, to monitor it, to mitigate it, and that it can't, be challenged, the reasonableness, if it is reasonable to undertake these provisions. If there's violations, means of remedying those violations. And then the big component for the city of Los Angeles was that in this original bargain, the Great Basin can't interfere with its water production gathering facility. So we couldn't interfere with that. And this is actually quite unique. Most air pollution control districts can shut down facilities that are operating out of compliance and impacting public health. So whether it's a gold mine, geothermal power plant, chemical plant, if public health impact is occurring, the air quality district can actually do something about that. Whereas at Owens Lake, that was something given away in this original bargain. And so we had to develop and design ways of controlling dust without the use of water or with the use of water, but it was up to the city of Los Angeles to decide how they control those emissions. What we decided is what would work and what level of controls were needed. It's really important to bring this in because this has been a substantial component of getting to where we are at today. And just looking through this list of litigation of appeals, lawsuits, both on behalf of LADWP and Great Basin, it hasn't been a smooth trajectory. There's been a lot of contentious components of it, a lot of money spent on legal fees. And then the bottom three of all of these columns, you can see that there are still ongoing litigation in 23, 24. There's been substantial planning efforts since 1998 in your bottom right. And we've had 2 federally EPA approved state implementation plans in 1998, which actually didn't have an attainment demonstration associated with it. The only plan that's ever been approved without an attainment demonstration, but it had provisions to increase controls at Owens Lake until we met the federal clean air standards. In 2016, we got a new plan approved that basically incorporates what Great Basin refers to as the grand bargain. The grand bargain is 48.6 square miles of dust control on Owens Lake. And there's a lot going on in this image, and I hope you'll refer to it into the future, looking back, asking yourself questions of what they're doing out at Owens Lake and how they're doing it. But here you can see the different types of dust controls. You can see the extensive air monitoring network we have. So 13 permanent meteorological and PM10 monitoring locations, special purpose monitoring on the lake bed that's done by LADWP. We have a bunch of little triangles that are actually emissions monitoring sites directly on the lake bed, and there's over 200 of those at Owens Lake. All of these report near real-time data and observation intervals from 5 minutes an hour. We're on a daily model. It's a really, really beautiful system, and I recommend anybody interested looking at this complex system on our website, and you can understand the intricacies of it. I'm just going to go through real quickly kind of the breakdown of what's out there, and we can talk about why it's out there like that. And so you can see there's gravel, there's vegetation, both of which have about 5 square miles. There's shallow flooding, which is the most extensive use of dust control technique. And then we have modifications to shallow flooding. And the modifications to shallow flooding came in subsequent agreements with the city of Los Angeles to conserve water, yet to still maintain the air pollution controls needed to protect public health. Here we have a brine and we have tillage. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of these control measures when we talk a little bit about the performance criteria and enforcement, which is an ongoing everyday activity. Great Basin has 23 staff members, air quality specialists, scientists, air monitoring technicians, It takes a group of 23 to run this program. Here we've got the brine, another 4 square miles, and we've got the tillage, it's 2 square miles. And then we've got what's also called dynamic water management. Dynamic water management was another water saving provision where we were able to look at historic data and refine the periods required for shallow flooding. So currently shallow flooding is required from October 16th through the end of the dust year, which is June 30th. We have various ramp down periods to save water, and then the special dynamic water management provisions to have early shutoff and a late turn on. There's also additional eligible areas that we've yet to utilize for dynamic water management, but there are more opportunities for water conservation. There's also a lot going on in this graph, but the take home point is Owens Lake was using a lot of water. It was the cheapest, easiest way to get dust control out, to meet the timelines, to meet the Clean Air Act requirements. We were using up to about 60,000 acre feet a year, with the potential of up to 95,000 acre feet a year with a total 48.6 square mile build out. With these water saving provisions of brine, tillage, and dynamic water management, we are currently using roughly 60,000 acre feet a year. And not all of the water usage is directly from dust control. On some big snowmelt runoff years, we actually use Owens Lake to spread some of the excess water. All right, let's get into the details of ongoing compliance and enforcement, just so you understand what it takes to maintain this operation and facility. Gravel requires either 2 inches or 4 inches, depending on whether or not it's on a geotextile fabric, right? It likes to sink into the lake. It has a long durability. It was something that originally everybody thought you put gravel out everywhere and the pollution is taken care of. However, that's not the case. As you can see here, if there's sand intrusion, those areas get filled in and you have deposition, and yesterday's deposition areas or tomorrow's emissions. And so these require constant maintenance in certain areas, especially where there are uncontrolled sources adjacent. We have the managed vegetation areas. These are actually quite stable. The vegetation, if the salinity of the lake bed is favorable for plant growth, actually do quite well and don't change very quickly over time. So something that was originally thought to be, that was going to be really challenging when we had a lot of uncontrolled areas, has actually turned out to be a really favorable option, especially as the surface of the lake bed is stable. And we've had natural vegetation encroaching in gravel areas, natural vegetation encroaching into shallow flood areas. We've actually had vegetation areas doing so well outside of vegetation. We've used sod harvesters to move that vegetation to other areas to control emissions. Managed vegetation is one of those areas that allows an air pollution control officer to sleep at night. If the water goes off, if the sprinkler systems break, the vegetation is still out there. It's out there next month. It's out there, for a year. We've actually had a fire out at Owens Lake, and the vegetation came back stronger and healthier than ever. The shallow flooding, the most extensive use of dust control at Owens Lake, 30 square miles roughly, works very well because the surface is saturated. It's inundated with water. However, water and the saturation of water can change quite quickly. It can happen with temperature, can happen with wind, can happen with breakdowns. We've had some jet crashes where areas had to be shut down, and these areas immediately revert back to the emissive state that they were prior to control, and can be quite a problem if that water is no longer there. Brine has been a very successful hybrid alternative to the shallow flooding, which actually comes from the Los Angeles Aqueduct. What brine? It can either be wet brine or dry brine, a capillary crust, or an evaporative crust. I don't know if we need to get into all the details, but if anybody has questions, feel free to interrupt or ask at the end. But with brine, if we can control 75% of the area, meeting those crust thickness requirements or wetness requirements, the area is non-emissive to the point of causing air quality violations. Originally, the Air District was concerned about the stability of brine. It actually turns out to be very stable, and over time has been very consistent and predictable, which is very important. All of these brine areas do have Backham shallow flooding backup. So if they don't work, there are provisions to revert it back to shallow flooding, which is one of our best available control measures. It's the backstop. Tillage. So the tillage has several different performance criteria it has to meet. Do a quick time check. Okay. There's surface roughness, right? So the height of your rows, the depths of your furrows. There's emissions monitoring with the Sensit and sand catchers. There's emissions monitoring with ambient air quality monitors. We also use a UAV to do induced particulate emissions testing, so we can actually determine whether or not the lake bed surface is emissive prior to a wind event. The performance criteria that allow us to know what the surface is like and the risk of air contaminants being released in a wind event is really important. What we want to be is preventative. We don't want them to occur, not reactive to the events happen. Okay, now we have a short period of time to get this area back into compliance. Tillage has been really a mixed bag as far as durability and success, depending on how you gauge success. From an air regulatory perspective, it's you put it in and it works, and you can know it's going to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a day. Tillage is more dynamic. It'll sink, it'll start to blow, the clods will crumble, the efflorescent salts will infiltrate to the surfaces. And so it's one of the most extensive areas where it requires a lot of oversight, and is one of the dust control areas that, or types of dust control methods that keep me up at night. We use LiDAR, and this is what you're seeing here, to monitor the areas and track their changes over time. It does give us, a trend, which is actually quite valuable. We don't have any remote sensing capabilities. And so with, as you can imagine, 48 square miles of dust control, how do you know what's going on everywhere all the time? With the shallow flooding, we do use the remote sensing. So with the tillage, we use an airplane. It has LiDAR monitors on it. With the dynamic water management, pulling water on and off is quite simple, but it's, how do you measure or monitor whether or not the areas become a problem and then need to be reset with shallow flooding. And so we have basically area requirements where additional monitoring is required and timeframes for that to happen, so we can basically keep our fingers on the pulse the entire time for these areas and get it back into a shallow flood state if need be in an appropriate time frame. All of that really comes down to this, and the take home from this is, the success of dust control reductions at Owens Lake. And in the blue, you can see the PM10 levels, and this is a maximum of daily averages. So you're looking at the NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And you can see there in 2001, the day over 20,000. And you can see the trend of the blue over time decreasing, right? And it's not linear because the lake is quite dynamic. The winds aren't the same every year. New areas open up. I'm sure it's very similar down here at the Salton Sea, but here in 2020, 2021, 2022, we are at very low levels of PM10 as the highest days. The red is another lake, terminal saline lake, similar to the Salton Sea, actually probably more similar to the Salton Sea than Owens at this time, is Mono Lake, which does have water inflow and does have limitations to the export, but isn't meeting the air quality standards. In green, you can just see all the other sources of PM10 maximum days. And I don't know off the top of my head where these are. I know a lot come from Arizona. And I did have an opportunity to look at some of the air quality data from 2022 of Imperial and Riverside counties. The south end of the lake, I think the highest daily average was in the 800s, and the highest in the north end of the Salton Sea was in the 400s. So you're in a good place compared to Owens Lake now. As the lake changes, I'm sure you will encounter other challenges associated with that. Hopefully some of these tools will be beneficial to you and your program in the future. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk about Owens Lake. I truly feel that it is a bellwether for terminal saline lakes. We see similar issues up at Lake Abert, at the Great Salt Lake, at Lake Arima in Iran, the Aral Sea. and potentially, at the Salton Sea as the lake level starts to change. This is a photo of Mono Lake. This is one of our Sense-It monitoring networks where we run a very similar program to Owens Lake. And with that, I would like to just open it up for questions.
Any questions from board members?
I just would like to say thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. And just because of the slide, the last slide that we saw, how interesting to me that now Mono Lake is more emissive. And when we went on our trip, we saw that as well. And I'm trying to think of the vegetation around Mono Lake. So there isn't as much vegetation, correct me if I'm wrong, as there is around Owens Lake. Is that correct?
Well, the difference is that as the lakes have receded, at Mono Lake, the natural vegetation hasn't encroached to the current lake level.
Okay.
And that was the case at Owens Lake as well, but we have planted vegetation out at Owens Lake in those areas. So there are, larger existing vegetations on the emissive areas where that is not the case at Mono.
Just the first thing that where my mind goes to is obviously the Salton Sea. We have so much desert surrounding the Salton Sea, which also contributes, right, to PM10. So that was I just wondered about the surrounding area, if that was also a reason, just, correlations I'm trying to bring to my mind.
Yeah, we refer to those as off-lake sources.
Mhm.
And they can be very challenging because there are other influences, regional PM10 events,
Mhm.
other off-lake sources like natural dune systems and, other natural sources that do have flash flood areas where there's deposition, wildfires. And so those are actually a lot more difficult to quantify and qualify, other than wildfires, because dust and wildfires usually are segregated. Up at Mono Lake, we don't have the off-lake sources because of that upland vegetation, is timber and brush.
Mhm.
Whereas at Owens Lake, it's more similar to the Salton Sea where we do have, off-lake dune systems
Mhm.
quite extensively around various areas of the lake. Got a good handle at some of those, and we do have some dust control projects in like the Keeler Dunes area. But yeah, quantifying and qualifying those off-lake sources can be a challenge, and separating them out from what's actually coming from the lake bed, which has primarily been Great Basin's focus up until, recent history.
Thank you so much for making the trip out here. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
So mitigation water at Owens, how much do you have allotment per year?
So we use about 60,000. The Los Angeles Aqueduct on an average year exports about 420,000 acre feet. So, it's a substantial piece of that. And it does change actually quite dramatically. And I think in recent years, that's been emphasized and reemphasized over and over with really big years and really dry years. And so it's really up to the city of Los Angeles to decide, how much they use, how much they need to meet compliance. But yeah, that's the allocation at this point in time.
And so that is, the mitigation water is used for vegetation establishment, right? In some of your applications.
Yeah, it's used for the shallow flooding and then the managed veg. And this is actually a pretty good opportunity to state this. This is the amount of water that's used. So for traditional shallow flooding in freshwater areas, we use about 4 acre feet of water per acre to control emissions. In the vegetation areas, to establish vegetation, we use about 3 acre feet of water per acre to get it to grow. Once it's established, we can reduce the water to about 1 acre foot per acre to maintain that vegetation. In the brine, the tillage, and the dynamic water management areas and gravel areas, we use 0 acre feet of water per acre.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Supervisor.
Thank you, Chair and colleagues, and great presentation.
Thank you.
I think obviously you bring up many points that we've been trying to think through as it pertains to the Salton Sea and the different partnerships that actually exist. So I'm just wondering, to get to where you are right now, for example, I can't believe you guys have that many air monitoring systems. how did that happen? And I ask because we have maybe a couple here in the Salton Sea area. And I'm wondering if that was LA, is it LAWP, LADWP, or was that the state of California that really emphasized that effort?
It's all of the above. So originally, the state of California actually assisted Great Basin in getting our first set of monitors out there. And then Great Basin, as we developed our program further, we, built up an air monitoring staff, which is really the backbone of our program. And, built out that network to try to capture as best as possible, what is actually going on. Using the best available modeling. Okay, where do we need these monitors? And then there's the feasibility. There were some areas where you just can't monitor, you can't get permission. Other areas where you could, but the monitor wasn't really effective. And then, if there isn't the monitoring, I think this is the point you bring up, it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. It doesn't count, right? You need to have the monitoring to know what the impacts of the air pollution are, in our communities and, around these sources. The DWP also has been a big component of how our monitoring looks like today, advocating for better science, better understanding to get to the point of where we know it's actually working and what success is. So it started small, with assistance from the state. Great Basin built it out to what was, manageably feasible. And then we really fine-tuned it in different settlements agreements with the city of Los Angeles to get to where we are today.
Did you say that Owens Lake is about a third of the size of Salton Sea?
Correct.
And how many monitors do you have?
We have 13. And that's regulatory monitors around the shoreline. And we also have several, I don't know the exact number, I think it's 6 or 7 on the lake bed itself. But that's just to make sure that the controls out there are working before those air contaminants leave the lake bed.
When was this agreement put together? I know you started this presentation with 1913, but I'm just wondering, when did this when did this agreement come together with the state of California and LAWP to ensure that there was some sort of effort to mitigate and to ensure that somebody was accountable at the end of the day?
Yeah. So that was the first big battle, and that was the legislation that took place at the state level. So, similar, I think, to the Salton Sea Authority's legislation, AB 71. I don't remember the exact year that took place, but Great Basin went through with DWP, the legislation effort of SB 270, which was that original bargain and the trade-off of not interfering with their water production and divergence, but yet still being able to meet the air quality standards. And so, that work went on for decades before we came to the table and said, okay, we know what needs to be controlled and we know what works. This is how you're going to do it. And then the city of LA contested that. And when we spent years in the courts to actually implement those things. And so it's been a back and forth, and, the city of Los Angeles can challenge Great Basin's requirements. And so let's say next year I wanted to double our air monitoring network and it's going to cost another $1 million. With SB 270, we assess the city of Los Angeles those monies to pay for the program, and they have the ability to appeal that. They can say it's not reasonable, you don't need them, and then we end up in litigation at the state, and then the state weighs in. And if the state weighs in and makes a decision that's favorable or non-favorable to a party, they can challenge that in court. And so these are the processes, unfortunately, we're all too familiar with. But having that legislative backing and having been through some of these challenges in the past, it does facilitate getting things in sooner and quicker and working out, agreements.
So at the
Today.
end of the day, would you say that the state is the enforcer, if you will, and LADWP needs to follow through?
So yeah, the state can enforce our plans and rules as well as the federal EPA. Typically, they defer that enforcement to Great Basin. They've been there as a stakeholder, and a participant, but And yeah, they, provide resources to assist with that, but really it is Great Basin that has been responsible for all of the enforcement. I mean, there are the backstops for the state and federal EPA to come in and provisions for them to, tighten things up or require certain things, but Great Basin's taking the lead on that.
Have you ever had this type of conversation with folks at South Coast Air Quality Management District?
About the Salton Sea, no,
All right.
but I'd be more than happy to.
I think that's
engage.
gonna be important to connect those dots with our Air Quality Management District as well as maybe Imperial County if they so choose.
Mhm.
I'm assuming that LA, the DWP, I keep screwing that up, but LA did not want to have to pay up all these resources. And that's why you've been in litigation.
That's correct.
But at the end of the day, they are doing so. And I'm wondering, like, and what year was that when that all happened?
So the SB 270 and legislative part was 1983. The first planning effort was in 1996, 97, 98. And our first plan was adopted in 98. We didn't get dust control mitigation until 2001. And really, a decent sized build out until about 2006.
I'm just wondering, could there have been maybe some sort of lessons learned? A model, if you were an example of what occurred there at Owens Lake and LADWP with the Salton Sea and the state and ID and CVWD and what their roles potentially could have been. I just see that there seems to be a gap there on our end.
Yeah, there are several lessons learned. I think, each case is slightly different. At Owens, we are, I think, very fortunate that it's a lot simpler. There's more or less one landowner, and that's the state of California. There's more or less one party responsible for the water diversions and the drying of the lake, which is the city of Los Angeles. Other stakeholders and then air quality. So if we look at those three components of who's doing the work, who's requiring the work, and on whose property, it's Great Basin, LADWP, and the State Lands Commission. We have other stakeholders involved with, now that there's water back on the lake, we have California Fish and Wildlife. We have, tribal stakeholders, 5 local tribes in the area. We have BLM. And so it, has become a lot more complex over time, especially as there's become interest in the resources out there. So I think the Salton Sea, you guys are starting from the other end of the spectrum. Owens Lake was lifeless. It had nothing, and now we're bringing that back and starting to come into this more complicated situation that, has more stakeholders involved and more interest. In Salton Sea, you have those now. And so little different spectrums, but I think a lot of lessons learned that, can be exchanged.
Yeah, I'm just perplexed by this. And I feel like we're kind of been going in circles for a long time. And I'm just wondering out loud here, what more do we need to do to ensure that the state play the role that it assumed? But at the same time, potentially ID as well as CVWD, and who knows that they would want to. But I just see in order for us to try to figure out this gargantuan of concerns that we have with the Salton Sea, I don't see how the state alone will come through on its obligations. It hasn't yet. And I'm not saying that one entity can, or that we bring all these entities together that we can, but something's got to give. And I'd like to figure out what that plan could look like moving forward. Bringing all these groups together in unison, if that's at all possible. And trying to figure out what our plan of action is gonna be. We have all kinds of strategies already. We have all kinds of documents already. We already have seen so many different budgets and studies, legislation. I assume that it's got to be in there somewhere. So anyways, I'm just thinking out loud, venting out loud. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's astounding what you got going on out there in comparison to where we are right now with the Salton Sea. It makes me feel like we got a lot of work to do still. And that obviously not enough is being done either locally, regionally, and even statewide, and even at a federal level. To be able to bring in all these supports to get to where you are at Owens Lake, I think is amazing. Knowing all the troubles we've gone through here and the challenges. But thank you. I'll
Thank you.
end my questions there.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, by the way. Welcome. Super informative. Yeah, great. A lot of questions. That's good. I'm curious about, I'm not really familiar with the area you're talking about.
Mr. Patrick, we're having audio issues. It's a really good conversation here. Can we address the audio issues here?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I'm curious about the demographic populations around the lake. It seems to be more remote than perhaps even our demographics. So you can talk about that for a minute. And then also the air quality monitors that you were talking about, are all of those local, or do any of those extend beyond the perimeter of the lake or the shores of the lake? I mean, here we have air quality issues that extend, well beyond even our valley. And so our concern is also, how do we manage that? So if you could address those. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the demographics around the lake bed, there are, roughly about 10,000 people that live, in and around the general vicinity of Owens Lake. Roughly about 40 to 50,000 people that were impacted by, the emissions from Owens Lake in that airshed. Most of the incorporated towns and then the non-incorporated communities in the Owens Valley are quite small, varying from, 1,000 residents to 10,000 residents in the Bishop area. And that, the city of Los Angeles owns most of the land around the communities in the valley. And then most of the other land is BLM and the Forest Service, so that area isn't changing. So the demographics have been very consistent over time. We do air quality monitoring outside of just the general Owens Lake area. We monitor in our communities with regulatory monitors. And we also do extensive low-cost sensor monitoring throughout the Owens Valley and up into the Mono Basin, just because that's a lot more affordable. And yeah, technology is changing quite rapidly, so we're trying to utilize that as well.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to get a sense of what was the acreage that you mentioned you were mitigating,
The acreage,
the total acreage?
yeah, so I think it's like, I don't know the acreage, but it's 47.8 square miles. Which is what we're mitigating now.
And the reason I was asking is I was trying to get a sense of the magnitude of your mitigation program in comparison to the 10-year plan.
Yeah.
And so what is the 10-year plan, Patrick? Is that 30,000? And, knowing that we have some goals that we're trying to hit, that we would mitigate so many acres by X year. And I think we're not hitting those targets. I'm trying to get a sense of, how did you, you talked about all the different mitigation options that you're using, that the kind of the shallow flooding and gravel, vegetation, all of that. And I'm just wondering if there was any sort of priority system that you put in place to say, this is why we're doing shallow flooding, this is why we're doing vegetation. What was the reasoning behind doing one versus the other. And knowing that, and in your opinion, what's the quickest way to get it done? I think I heard you say water.
Yeah.
So, just kind of keeping that in mind that we're kind of falling short, and if we wanted to move along quicker, is one easier than another option?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's actually probably one of the most common questions I get when I take members of the public out on the lake is, how did you get to where you're at and why does everything look like this? And you can see that in the complicated mosaic of what's out there. And so the way we started was by doing the direct emissions monitoring on the lake bed, because we wanted to know where the emissions were coming from, what the quantity was, and what was its contribution to the PM10 in the air. And so we could focus our mitigation measures at, the highest priority areas that had the most emissions for the smaller areas. That was, our key focus. And so the first build out was 15 square miles. And it was in zone 1, 2, and 3, which were the most emissive sand sheets on the lake bed. And then over time, as we've monitored further, we've determined, okay, these other areas now need to be controlled. We still can't meet the clean air mandates. They weren't the highest priority. We developed the other techniques. And so that has continued to change and be refined. There's been transition projects, once areas have been, the soils have been reclaimed and can grow vegetation. And so you end up in this complicated mosaic, what we have now, but, originally it was direct emissions testing on the lake bed to determine the source contributions and highest priority areas to control.
Thank you. That makes sense. And it feels like we have bits and pieces of information that are all being gathered by different entities, and it's really hard to get a sense of the total universe of information that we might be gathering if someone's working on it. And so it does seem to me that especially you just mentioned that it all started with gathering the information with the monitors. And that kind of led you to focus on the areas that you needed to focus on, come up with some sort of priority. And so, I think that, so we have what, two air pollution districts out here, right? Supervisor, you're on one, and I think you might be on another one. But to the extent that that's the first thing that we need to do is consolidate that information, do you know if how many monitors South Coast State QMD has out there, or?
Couple. Not more than,
Four.
I think maybe 3 or 4.
And Imperial, about the same or more?
County has, I believe we have 7, but none of them are located on the sea.
Okay.
And in addition, Imperial Irrigation District has their own monitoring.
I think we were told last week there are 6 that are part of the QSA JPA,
Okay.
but those are, I think
And-
they said that those were science monitors, and I really don't know the difference between a science monitor and a regulatory monitor.
And do you know, does anybody know? Because I don't know, but to what extent did the state use that information to come up with the 10-year plan, or how much of that information is guiding what areas are next to be mitigated? Anybody have any?
I can jump in here if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, really great question. So I wanted to jump in with to just share that that's absolutely a driving force in our prioritization of projects, is looking at areas of the most emissivity for the Salton Sea Management Program, and then also areas where they will be most soon to be exposed. So just wanted to answer that question for you because it came up here, that's really an important prioritization that we're doing in the Salton Sea Management Program to ensure that the projects can be as beneficial as possible in terms of air quality.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, in the interest of time and not to cut short this important conversation, but I wanted to also mention that we also have Dr. Lowe, who's going to be talking about biological toxins after this, and then we're going to be discussing some existing legislation. And it might be useful to focus the conversation on Mr. Kiddu's presentation and Owens Lake, and we can consolidate all of that conversation at the end when we have
Okay.
the complete
I,
fact set.
okay, I do see Director Cardenas has his hand up, so I'll let him make some final comments and then we'll move on to the next item.
Yeah, just real quickly, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the conversation. I just want to revisit Supervisor Perez's comments. I think they were valid in terms of the inquiries, and you know, there has been significant landmark climate change legislation as of late, and I'm just curious. You know, we have an active SSMP right now, and the measurements are around acreage. You know, based that, or considering that there's been substantial changes in regards to hydrology and some of the other challenges, I'm just wondering if acreage still is the appropriate metrics to use in terms of measuring public health. And because there's been significant changes, you know, there could be some discussions on maybe enhancing the surveillance beyond the acreage. And so to Supervisor Perez's point, I think maybe that is a conversation that we should start at the Salton Sea Authority with California Natural Resources Agency in terms of looking at possible reopeners in regards to measuring public health and the nexus that it has with acreage. So I don't want to necessarily end with a great presentation, but more end if our member agencies give direction. And the direction that I'm looking for consideration, Mr. Chair, is that we direct our executive director or a general manager to have conversation with the California Natural Resources Agency and determine if acreage is the appropriate measurement when addressing public health issues at the Salton Sea. And again, it's an opportunity to revisit our responsibility at the sea. So I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair. What I'm hopeful is that we can give direction to our executive director to work with California Natural Resources and determine if acreage is the appropriate measure when considering public health issues and habitat at the Salton Sea. Those are my comments, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I don't see an issue with that. And unless I hear otherwise from our colleagues here, which I don't, everybody's shaking their head no, I think you have some general direction to go ahead and do that. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to you. I think you wanted.
You have one member of the public. Mr. Michael Cohen would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Go ahead, Mr. Cohen.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks for an excellent presentation, Mr. Kiddu. Just a quick sideline, noted that the 47 square miles that are under active management at Owens Lake is almost exactly equivalent to 30,000 acres, the SSMP target under the 10-year plan. So my question is about costs. I didn't hear much about costs. So Mr. Kiddu, if you could speak to the total, I guess, capital investment at Owens Lake, and then any estimates you have on annual O&M costs. And is LADWP shouldering that entire burden, or is there any state and or federal grants or other support coming to meet those costs? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So DWP, the City of Los Angeles, does fund 100% of the costs. The complete total price tag of the dust control implementation at Owens Lake today is about $2.5 billion, which is a very hefty price tag. Pound for pound of emissions reductions is one of the cheapest fugitive dust control projects in the nation. The annual ongoing maintenance and operations for the City of Los Angeles is about $25 million a year. And that's, you know, to fund their full-time staff of about 75 employees. There's also the water offset, which, you know, that's 60,000 acre feet a year. If you say that that's 1,000 acre feet offset or $1,000 an acre foot offset, you're looking at 60 million of additional, you know, cost to use that water. And then They also fund Great Basins Program, which is about 7 to 8 million a year, depending on what the activities are.
All right, we're gonna wrap up the presentation now, and we're gonna move on. Oh, okay, hold on. Patrick has a few questions.
Quick questions that I wanted to make sure that you mentioned the number. I press it twice and it goes off. You mentioned the number 200 monitors also. Are those a special type of monitors that are on the playa? So you have a couple hundred of those plus you've got hundreds. So in actuality, you have hundreds of monitors.
That is correct. So the ambient air quality monitoring network, right, which is the regulatory monitors that measure the air quality, we have 13. That's the meteorological and air quality measure PM10. We have over 200 what we call dust ID sites, and these are comprised of a sand catcher, which is a passive tube that sits in the ground and measures sand accumulation. And we have an impacting device that we call a Sensit. The impacting device allows us to partition the sand movement over time. This test method is called the other test method 30. It's a federal EPA approved test method for fugitive dust. And it's very cost effective. There are no moving parts. They're durable. They don't break down. The tube itself is made of PVC and costs about $30. The Sensit unit, another couple thousand, and then a data logger and a battery and a radio antenna to transmit the data. So those 200 sites, distributed across the lake bed give us, the entirety of knowledge of what's going on the surface and what those air emissions are.
So your oversight at Owens Lake is strictly PM10, right?
Strictly PM10.
Does
It's a
not
non-attainment
include
area for PM10.
ecosystem restoration, does not include economic revitalization, doesn't include anything but PM10 monitoring and enforcement.
That is correct.
And you have and your Great Basin, what's the operating budget for Great Basin on an annual basis?
It's about 8 million.
8 million, and how much of that is attributable to Owens Lake?
Over 85% of that.
85% of that, and that's paid by LADWP?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. No more questions. Thank you, sir. We're gonna move on to Dr. Lowe.
Yeah, our next speaker is Dr. Lowe. He made a presentation to this board back in May. He's continued his work in this area, and I asked him to just provide an update on matters other than PM10 that might. I apologize, my mic was off again.
Okay. All right, thanks. Should I share my screen from my computer?
If you would.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Well, thanks for giving me the chance to give you a brief presentation of the work that we've been doing. I wanted to start off with a little bit of a explanation of how we kind of got into this project and the rationale for the studies that we're doing here. Okay. So I was introduced to the problem from discussing with communities in Coachella Valley, where the families were very concerned about their high incidence of childhood asthma. And in addition to that, they were also concerned about a number of other related immunologic, they thought immunologic symptoms such as nosebleeds, skin rash, eczema. And so we came into this looking into the question of whether or not the communities were pointing to the Salton Sea as what they thought was a source of the problem. And the question was whether or not the dust that was being produced at the playa was triggering these kinds of symptoms. And so a brief overview of what we've been finding is that the dust does in fact have an inflammatory response in a model that we've been studying, and then we've now started to do studies in the community to try and explain what we're seeing in the lab and relating it to what we're seeing in the environment in the region as well. And so the overall conclusion that we have so far, and I'll go through the details briefly on how we got there, is that we believe that there are bacterial toxins that are produced in the seawater that are then drawn into the playa and then brought up into the dust, and then people are breathing that, and that's leading to the symptoms that we're seeing. So the idea then behind it is that it's not just dust as dust. It's actually what's in the dust that may be an important contributing factor to the kind of disease that people are seeing in the region. And as I said, we have other symptoms that we also want to try to understand and explain there. So there's a whole cohort of researchers at UC Riverside that we've been collaborating with under this large kind of umbrella of Salton Sea Task Force. And so we started off with collecting dust samples from all around the region. This just only points to 2, but there's actually, I think, something like a dozen or so passive dust collectors all around the region, as well as further away from the Salton Sea itself. And the point of this particular illustration is to show that a lot of over time in the last few decades, the geography of the region, as the lake dries up, more of the playa is exposed, especially at the northwestern end as well as the southeastern end. And I think that may be relevant to what we're seeing in the region. So what we've done in the lab is we've been taking the dust collected from the region and then setting up a model in the lab where we expose laboratory mice to these aerosols continuously over a period of days or weeks, and then looking at the question of what kind of pathology or disease we might be seeing. And initially we were naively thinking that because asthma is generally associated with allergic disease, we were looking for allergic disease in the mice. However, we were surprised to find that we did not actually see allergic disease at all. We actually saw a kind of an acute inflammatory response, a little bit more similar to what you might see in say, pneumonia from bacterial infections. And so we then further confirmed that whatever is in the dust that's causing that seems to be a bacterial endotoxin. And we confirmed that in mice that were mutant that lacked that receptor, and they did not react to the Salton Sea dust at all. I wanted to maybe briefly explain what endotoxin is and why it's important. Our immune systems react to different types of bacterial components as a kind of a early defense alarm system. And that endotoxin, which is a component of gram-negative bacterial walls, is not intrinsically chemically toxic. It actually is the toxicity comes from the way our body reacts to it. It's like this, I call it a Chicken Little, fire alarm type of response. And that exposure to these components triggers an inflammatory response in our bodies. And just, I'm not going to go into the details of the data here, but suffice to say that we have used a genetic mutation to confirm that it's really this endotoxin receptor that is responsible for that kind of panic inflammatory response in the mice. And so then our question is like, is that related to asthma-like symptoms in communities at the Salton Sea? So we also looked then at if endotoxin is causing this response, we wanted to actually measure levels of endotoxin in dust samples collected from around the region. So for example, if we look at samples collected near campus at UC Riverside, we have very low levels of endotoxin. On the other hand, if we look at collection sites, dust that was collected in Imperial Valley, Northern Imperial Valley, you see, 100 times higher levels in the region near the southern playa there, which is kind of alarming because that's really high. And normally endotoxin would degrade in the environment. So the fact that we're detecting such high levels in environmental samples is definitely a concern. And so then the question from that is, what is it? Does it relate to symptoms and things like that? So in collaboration with HARC, we did a survey. We had about 850 survey responses from across the Salton Sea region. You can see the green dots represent survey responses that cover from Coachella Valley all the way down to Imperial Valley, and then both the North Shore, Salton City, and so on. So the responses were based on a survey on asthma symptoms, other related immunologic symptoms, also some basic demographic data as well. And so we were surprised to find that if you look at the incidence of asthma, now I think our evidence is that asthma is actually probably underdiagnosed. So if you ask families about whether or not the kids have had an actual diagnosis, it's already alarming enough that the incidence goes from about 12% in Coachella Valley, which is about double the rate across the state of California, to closer to 30% in Imperial County. If you look at symptoms, which is maybe a more sensitive detection, because maybe people didn't go see the doctor and get a diagnosis, that incidence of symptoms actually goes even higher to above 35%, potentially approaching 40% incidence in Imperial Valley. But the interesting feature here is that we can see this gradient that although it's high in Coachella Valley, it really has this geographic gradient that it continues to increase as you go further south toward Imperial Valley. And so that if we try to compare that to the levels of endotoxin and the inflammatory response we see in the lab, there's an interesting potential correlation, not just to the highest incidence of asthma type symptoms in Imperial Valley, it also seems to be where, of course, you have so much more of the exposed playa, as well as the highest concentrations of bacterial endotoxin that we're able to measure in the dust. And so we are doing additional statistical analysis of this to try and develop a model for what the risk factors are for this relationship. And then also looking at other immunologic features. So often the families are saying that they're thinking the asthma, the skin rash, the nosebleeds are all tied together. And interestingly, what we found here, for example, if you look at eczema, the incidence is actually lower in Imperial Valley and quite a bit higher in the North Shore region. So it suggests that, in fact, the cause of this other kind of immunologic symptom, so this rash, is actually potentially unrelated to asthma and may be from a different cause, which also would be worth pursuing and studying. Nosebleeds are a little bit more uniformly present across at a fairly high incidence across the Salton Sea region, and that may also have a separate cause as well as a separate way of managing, maybe better ways of moisturizing nasal passages of the kids and things like that. So I just want to make clear that this is just data that we're still in the process of analyzing, and also to remind everybody that mice are not humans. So even though we did these studies in laboratory mice, it is suggestive, and we do have lab data from actual environmental samples, as well as the epidemiology of the survey across the region. But we still really need some more detailed clinical research in the kids, the families, and other residents of the region. So thanks for your attention, and I can stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. I'm gonna open it up for questions from the dais.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Dr. Lowe, Go UCR, Highlanders. So over the course of years, even dating back at the state level, when I was a legislator, I kept hearing from folks about the concerns they had around rashes, as well as nosebleeds from kids, and just pain in their chests when they would play sports. But there was never any evidence that indicated that potentially this may be coming from the PM10 and issues that we have around the Salton Sea. I guess my question for you, Dr. Lowe, you mentioned there that more research needs to be conducted, but I am wondering, what would a timeline look like so that we can get to some sort of conclusion, so that we could begin to, if need be, use that data to help support our communities on the ground when it comes to these issues of concern, respiratory illnesses, asthma, nosebleeds, so on and so forth. I want to make sure that we continue to follow through with these studies, which the community have been asking for years. I'm happy we're finally here.
Well, I think you can by addressing the asthma, the eczema, and the nosebleeds as separate clinical issues, I think that's already a start. So if we say, let's address the nosebleeds and not assume that it's directly responsible, it's not directly because of the asthma, then if you say, well, let's focus specifically, can we moisturize nasal passages? Are there sprays that we can develop and things like that, and address that directly, because that's quite, high incidence among the kids there, and certainly very concerning. On the rash, we have really not gotten too deep into that question yet, because we were quite surprised to see that they didn't match up with the asthma at all. And our interest came into this because we were really interested in this question of the aerosol and the asthma. So it's certainly possible that the rash and skin rash may not be an aerosol related thing. It may be other kinds of environmental exposures, and that may take a little bit more time to sort out. On the asthma thing, I'm not pretending that there's any quick answers, but we certainly can see that from the incidents, especially the higher incidents in Imperial Valley, that it probably needs more investment in clinical care to manage those kids, because if the incidence is really that high, that is definitely something that needs attention of the healthcare system in the region.
But would you say that we have the evidence now to state that this asthma and nosebleeds are caused because of the dust? Is that enough information that we have to help support our claim for more resources, for more mobile health centers or mobile health, outreach workers and community care and things of that nature? Or do we still need to do more? I'm just trying to figure out what else can be done in order for us to prepare us to get there so that we can go to bat.
Well, yeah, you're right. It's a starting point, because we at least have identified components that are in the dust, and we can try and ask the questions like, are there things we could do to specifically target the reaction to that toxin? I know it's not a great solution, but things like encouraging masks for kids who are going to be outdoors, or what my colleagues is training families to develop indoor high efficiency air filters. All of those kinds of things that can reduce exposure to the aerosols. And that's kind of a natural experiment that, if we improve the air quality or what people are breathing, and then we can then follow it up with symptomatic surveys and saying, is it helping? Right? So doing those kind of direct links between the exposure conditions, controlling those conditions, and then saying, do you see a symptomatic improvement, is a big step in both asking whether or not we can attribute the disease symptoms to the dust, as well as actually improving, conditions for the kids being exposed.
Okay, just wondering what the next steps will be on our behalf as a Salton Sea Authority regarding these efforts. What can we do to help support Dr. Lowe, as well as how do we mobilize, if need be, the county of Riverside, potentially the county of Imperial, other nonprofits that provide community health, obviously our school districts. I'm just trying to figure out what next steps need to be done to get us there, so we can demonstrate if this is actually what's happening or not. Because I hear it every single time I go in the community. It doesn't matter when I go. And, we gotta have an answer for it. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Lowe.
Thank you. Supervisor Kelly?
So, Dr. Lowe, thank you. So I am a victim of nosebleeds. Every winter time when it gets really dry in the valley, I experience nosebleeds, usually this time of the year. So I do have some questions. As you shared your information, your initial findings that it is not an allergen that's causing the respiratory inflammation. It is the endotoxin that you've identified. And so do we classify it as asthma, or do we classify it as a respiratory respiratory inflammation caused by a external source?
Well, being careful about this is that, in medicine, asthma is only a diagnosis of symptoms, not necessarily a diagnosis of cause. And so, for example, there are non-allergic asthmas that can occur, say, if you lived in Central Valley and you're exposed to agriculture dust. If you live in an industrial, if you work in an industrial setting where you're exposed to a lot of dusts, you can also develop a non-allergic asthma. So asthma really is a diagnosis of symptoms, the wheezing, coughing, those kinds of things. So when pediatricians see a kid coming in with wheezing, 90% of the time it's allergic disease. And so they just, give the kid an inhaler and they say, we're done with it. So calling it asthma is partly a question of educating people to say, well, it isn't necessarily allergic asthma, but the symptoms are similar enough that the physicians often just treat it according to a standard formula. So, I like your version of saying, yes, a respiratory disease because of environmental toxins, which may help people think about it a little bit more clearly and not make an assumption that it's an allergen. But also to be clear that, people say living in a trailer or home may be exposed to indoor molds and fungus. And so they can still develop an allergic disease. We were focused on the question of what are the environmental contributions, but they can certainly coexist.
Sure. So other contributing factors could be playing a role. But in mitigation or actions that can be taken from your initial findings. So as Supervisor Perez has already mentioned, we've initiated programs in Imperial County for school air filtration so that the schools have cleaner air where they're eating and where they're assembling and in their classrooms. And that's an ongoing process. But what about the value, Dr. Lowe, of doing things in open air, including parks, trees, windbreaks, of where people are congregating in the open air setting? And it's something that we've talked about, and AB 617 initially started in the south part of our county. It's now been moved into an area of the North County, but still not to the Salton Sea communities, and we hope to see that expand. But where I'm going with this is that 100 years ago, a lot of our areas in Imperial Valley did have windbreaks of trees, and it did reduce a lot of the airborne particulate that was coming from the open desert. And we've been talking about it for quite a while. I would like to see those things maybe as a project that we focus on and building more of those natural barriers.
I think that, there's so many different complicated issues. You can try to reduce the amount of dust emissions. You can try and use the windbreaks to try to reduce the exposure. But if you don't have a way of reducing the toxicity of what's actually in the dust, then you still haven't really eliminated the problem. Or, as I said, alternatively, find ways to prevent kids from reacting to that toxin in the way that they would naturally. So there's still a lot of kind of dominoes that sort of have to be addressed in this whole cascade of disease process.
And I have just one last question, and I may have missed it, but the endotoxin source, have you been able to identify that?
Well, we've been collaborating with environmental microbiologists at Riverside, and they've been looking at the microbiome, the ecosystem in the Salton Sea. And, because it's very salty, the bacteria, it turns out they're mainly gram-negative bacteria who are the main producers of this particular endotoxin. And because they have to be adapted to the high salt, our hypothesis that we're working on trying to figure out is whether or not that forces them to produce a particularly resilient, environmentally stable version of that manages to make it into the playa and into the dust. We're doing those studies right now. I don't have the answer, but it's suggestive that there are bacteria in the Salton Sea water that are potentially capable of producing a particularly robust version of this toxin because they've had to be adapted to the high salt.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. And so we have some inland bodies, recreational water. We just we bought a ultrasonic buoy that is supposed to disperse algae and bacteria and continual monitoring. And so as we deploy that, we learn more out its success in a recreational lake. We'll share that with you as well.
Thank you. Dr. Lowe, I had a question, and I think it's related to the comment that Director Cardenas made about wanting to get a sense if acreage was like the right goal when it comes to mitigation and priority. And then, seeing your map there where it looks like you took some soil samples, and that's how you were able to get a measurement of the endotoxin, I think. I'm just wondering if now all of a sudden, and I think to Supervisor Perez's point is like, is that, are we really saying that? And how concrete is the conclusion that you've come up with, and are we there to be able to call it that, be able to say, okay, well, we know we have endotoxins in the exposed playa, and to the extent that it's impacting people's health, should those areas all of a sudden now be priority number one when we start thinking about where are we going to put our resources to mitigate those issues? And so, if I think I would want to get to a point where we're saying, we're either saying these areas are problematic because of the endotoxins, and we have enough information to suggest that and to say that, and hopefully push that up to Sacramento, in an effort to try to redirect maybe priority. But I don't know that that's what you're saying. So are you confident enough based on the research that you've done to date that we should be concerned about these areas with high levels of endotoxins?
Okay, there are two parts to this question. One is that it's never a good idea to have that level of endotoxin in your air. I mean, that's no question. So in terms of, most air quality monitoring, well, my weather app will tell me about pollen levels, but it's not measuring endotoxin. So we don't have routine analysis of that sort of thing. And it may be something that needs to be looked at, especially where you have things like this kind of microbial ecosystem. But the other part of it is knowing what the impact is in communities and having the detailed studies. So for example, if endotoxin is really the cause of these symptoms, we can do the clinical studies and say, what are the lab tests of those kids telling us? Is it going to tell us that the kids are predominantly showing us allergic disease, or are they showing the clinical features from the lab test that tells us, oh, it looks like they're actually showing this chronic response to the endotoxin? So those are the kinds of clinical studies that would be important to do to really look in that region, say, in Northern Imperial County, are all the kids showing signs of endotoxin responses versus allergic responses? Is it different in a different part of the region, or is it a different mix? I mean, those are the kinds of things where the monitoring includes impacts on the communities, and say, who's more likely to be affected by this kind of environmental exposure.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman, but I do need, I have a sense of needing to, thank you, Dr. Hill, by the way, for your, Dr. Lowe, for your presentation, really informative. It just seems like, it's no secret that most of these families are living in survival mode, and they're largely families who are living below the poverty line. And I'm not sensing a high degree of urgency about who's taking the leadership role in taking care of these families today. And that I find that really disappointing.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think that's why we're trying to figure out, well, what's the next step, right? Because, and I'm hoping that I don't know, it just that who would be responsible for, for taking this study to the next level? Is it a matter of funding? Is it, at what point do we turn it over to some other entity? I mean, I don't know if it would be like a healthcare district type of thing, or but I think that Dr. Lowe, I think, has shown that there's enough to be concerned about. I think it's just a matter of who do we show that to. And so I agree with you 100%.
And to make sure, give credit, I mean, we got on this because of the families. I mean, they pointed us in the right direction. So we kind of owe it to them.
Thank you.
So we can't do it alone, but we can do it. We must do it. And the question is how. And that's how this conversation began. It actually began 10 years ago when I joined this board. And I asked the question, after 10 years of implementing the QSA, why don't we know if the changes taking place at the sea are causing people to be sick or negatively affecting human health and safety? 10 years later, we still have the same question. It seems so fundamental to everything that we're doing that people should know that these endotoxins out there, how are they affecting their health? We should know that by now. So the question is, how do we mobilize the resources, and whose resources, right, to answer those questions? And that's what the authority staff and our team has been working on for the last several months. We've talked about it at our last several meetings. I think that the conversations that preceded this were critical to the conversations that will succeed this. Mr. Kidd, who mentioned AB 71, Assembly Member Perez, now Supervisor Perez, and a member of the Salton Sea Authority Board, was the author of that legislation. So we have been looking at what is the right framework, what I call a framework of assurance, so that the data that's out there, right? There's the monitoring implementation plan that was approved in November of 22 to aggregate all of the data gathering efforts that are out there. And there's supposed to be an annual plan that's published for that, so that people know. But that in and of itself is not a mitigation plan. It's just a data gathering plan. So somehow that data and other data that might exist needs to be aggregated so that the hole in the donut can be identified. We don't know what we don't know, and we need to know. We need the right questions so that we can get the right answers, so that we're spending the right resources on solving these very important problems for our local constituents. So the next conversation that we're going to have, I've asked Mr. Gonzalez, there's two pieces of legislation that are currently being considered by the state legislature. One is one by Assembly Member Garcia, and one is by Senator Padilla, and they both deal with health and monitoring. And I thought it would be useful for him to explain what those bills are, what they're not. And we are having, we're having conversations with anybody that'll talk to us about how do we, whether it's legislatively, administratively, or otherwise, address this problem to bring people together so that we can identify the scientists, the water agencies, and everyone. So I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Gonzalez right now. But before I do that, I see that Director Cardenas has his hand raised.
Yeah, just real quick, I do appreciate the comments, and the only discussion or the only input I might have is how do we take this from a natural resources discussion to a California Health and Human Service discussion. And I believe that the catalyst to that is Ms. Samantha Arthur. What I want us to ensure that we continue to channel the resource questions, the natural resources questions through CRNA, but also start a conversation with a health and human service agency as well. I think the catalyst to that can be California Natural Resources Agency, who can provide the bridge building that we need to cross over to the health and human services. So and for me, it's just two different areas of focus here. Obviously, natural resources and health and human safety. So we need to find the bridge, and the Salton Sea Authority can be that bridge to bridge those two agencies together based on some of the preliminary science that we're seeing here. So again, I am asking that we continue to work with natural resources, bridge us over to the health and human safety agencies, so we can pioneer language that brings those two agencies together to address some of the scientific findings, preliminary findings that we're hearing today. So that's just my final comments, and hopefully some of that legislation or proposed legislation will help us in the bridge building between those two agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Cardenas. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, directors. As Patrick noted, there's been two pieces of legislation that have been introduced in the last couple of weeks as part of this year's legislative session that deal with air quality. The first measure is
Hold on one second. We're having a little bit of a technical problem here locally. They're blowing us out with the sound system. We're going to see if we can. Your voice is beautiful, but it's a little loud. And it's not just you. Director Cardenas was also very loud. Try it now.
All right. Hopefully that sounds better.
Much better.
All right, great. As I was saying, one of the measures that's been introduced is by Assemblymember Garcia, and this is AB 1834. And this measure would authorize the counties of Imperial and Riverside to, by conducting an assessment, identify the communities in and around the Salton Sea that are most exposed to the degrading air quality arising from the Salton Sea. This measure is an intent bill. It doesn't have substantive language, but it is ostensibly a second attempt at legislation that the Assembly member introduced last year, which was AB 827, which would have required the state to conduct a preliminary analysis of what is occurring at the Salton Sea, really designed at getting at the very issues that Dr. Lowe was hitting on and determining what is happening at the sea and what is the health impact of what is happening on the sea on those surrounding communities. With respect to this bill's effort, it is very much a work in progress. In our conversations with Assemblymember Garcia, he is squarely focused on trying to definitively determine what is occurring at the sea, so that then we can go about, developing the tools that we need to address those concerns. And very much it gets at exactly, as I mentioned, what Dr. Lowe was saying is, we don't know what we don't know. And Dr. Lowe's research is critical, but ultimately you need resources to conduct it. And this bill is going to be an effort by Mr. Garcia to really try to bridge that gap. The second bill that's been introduced is SB 967 by Senator Padilla, and his bill is a little bit broader. It is a bill that would direct the University of California to develop a project that would allow for the creation of a 3-day regional winter dust forecast and dust storm early warning system across the eastern Coachella Valley and Imperial County. They acknowledge, and the Salton Sea is certainly part of the narrative of why they want to do this bill, but they very much are interested in this being a regional analysis that the UC would have to undertake. Because they consider, the problem to be one that is, both across eastern Coachella Valley and Imperial County, and not just the Salton Sea. Both of these measures, have been introduced. They're likely to be heard later in March, but more than likely in April. But of course, the big obstacle that they are going to confront this year is going to be costs. With the budget facing a significant shortfall, the cost of implementing these measures is going to be under considerable scrutiny. and it is going to be an obstacle that the measures are going to have to overcome in order to advance. Now, those are two pieces of legislation, but I would submit to you that there is a third piece of legislation relevant to the Salton Sea, and we actually discussed it at our last board meeting, and that is the state budget. As we discussed at our last board meeting, the governor has made a considerable investment for the Salton Sea as part of the state budget. It's a significant chunk of change, I believe $68.5 million. And I raise it because it is entirely at the discretion of the board if you want to attempt to provide direction to the legislator that in approving those dollars, that maybe there is a set aside, or maybe some dollars are focused more specifically at getting at this issue. Now, we are as an authority on record supporting the governor's proposal, but it is not uncommon, and frankly, it's quite common for the legislator to have different ideas of how dollars should be spent. What the governor's proposal effectively reflects is dollars on the table. If it is the will of the authority to have those dollars directed in a different way, prioritized in a different way, it is certainly your prerogative to do so. With respect to that budget investment, there is one hearing that's coming up. It's March 6th. It's going to be the Assembly Budget Subcommittee that's going to be hearing the specific investment. And it might actually be an initial opportunity for the authority in stating its support for that investment to, again, if it's the will of the authority, to state that, we want to see some dollars, some focus, some prioritization around getting at the very questions that Dr. Lowe was raising. So those are really kind of three pieces of legislation that will be actively moving through the legislator that are ultimately a forum and an opportunity for the authority to be on record about what it would like to see reflected in those pieces of legislation, but with respect to the budget, how we would like to see those dollars allocated and spent. So with that, certainly happy to take any questions from the board.
And I would say that there have been, within the context of addressing this problem, there have been discussions about what a possible fourth piece of legislation that might create the same framework that exists, using Owens Lake as a model, candidly, to create the same framework of assurance that exists for the Salton Sea. We don't have the answer, and we can't solve the problem alone. It's going to take a collaborative effort between local stakeholders, our federal and state partners, and the smartest scientific and technical minds to come up with this framework in a financially responsible way. And so with that, we are seeking direction from the board as to how to proceed with this. It would be our inclination that this should be part of a robust public discussion on an ongoing basis. We should have forums on a regular basis to discuss what's being done in this space so that people know that this is continuously being scrutinized and the issues are top of mind on the part of local, state, and federal leadership. And the authority can lead that effort, or certainly partner in that effort.
Questions from the dais?
I think, yes, Mr. Chair, I think that all these pieces of legislation could be helpful. And we're going to need some help at the state level, especially knowing how the budget is going to be impacted this year. So maybe I'd like to recommend, or maybe some direction could be that let's first have this discussion with Wade Crowfoot at CNRA to get his support or get his thoughts, and maybe integrate some of his points into that language, so that we're all in this together, per se, knowing that Wade has the governor's ear. I think that that's one way in which we can approach this before we go off on our own and stating that we support one piece of legislation over another, or all pieces of legislation, without having any type of input, consultation, direction from CNRA. So I want to put that out there for my colleagues to think about in the next few minutes. And potentially this could be an action item.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should certainly connect with our partner agencies in Sacramento. imagine that we might have already done some of that. Horacio, did you talk about that, or Patrick, about which piece of legislation seems to be, are they both supported? Is one more supported than another one?
Are you saying discussions with the Natural Resources Agency or with the
Sure.
Assembly? No,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
haven't
specifically
had
Wade.
those conversations at any significant level.
I'm sorry?
We have not had those conversations.
Well, it's time we have it.
Other than the conversations that we've had within our board meetings the last number of months.
These two pieces of legislation, are they very similar, or what's the main difference between?
They're kind of different. One is one, go ahead, Horacio.
Yeah, so and a great question, Director Estrada. The legislation is certainly different. Mr. Garcia's legislation is directly focused on the Salton Sea, and really designed. Again, it's an intent bill now, but if we look at last year's legislation as an indicator, it's very much designed to try to assist in answering the questions that Dr. Lowe was raising. What are the kind of airborne contaminants that are arising from the sea, and what is the impact that they're having on the community? Mr. Padilla's legislation is much broader. He's more focused on kind of overall dust pollution across the eastern Coachella Valley and Imperial County. And again, while they acknowledge the Salton Sea as a component of it, he's also looking at, the larger dust storms that are endemic in the Coachella Valley and Imperial that occur, a couple times a year, end up knocking out power. And it's really kind of an effort to try to figure out if there's a way to develop early warning systems for folks. That said, there is a mention in the legislation around the importance of developing actionable information for sensitive communities. Actionable information is very similar to what Mr. Garcia is after in terms of identifying, what is happening at the sea and what is that impact that's occurring in the community. So there is similarity. It's just that Mr. Garcia is much more fine-tuned to the Salton Sea versus Senator Padilla. It's just a little bit of a broader effort.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. So it seems like the two former bills, they don't have any funding attached to it. So
Mhm.
that, that's not going to help us. But the 68 million, I mean, is it possible to do a request for a set aside for health mitigation? Maybe send folks to the March committee hearing,
Mhm.
to the lobby, and maybe even families. I don't know, but it seems like that's the more immediate opportunity
Mhm.
to get some action.
Director, excellent point. I will say, the conversation with Mr. Crowford and of course Samantha, who's on our board, will be important just because the proposal that was put forward by the governor was ostensibly developed by the SSMP. So certainly one of the things that just it's going to be a consideration is redirecting those dollars and the magnitude of that redirection. What impact will it have on what's being proposed? But absolutely, it is entirely again the authority's prerogative, and B, fairly common for legislative budget subcommittees to have differing ideas of how dollars should be spent. The dollars are on the table. The governor's proposing to spend them on the Salton Sea, and it is certainly beneficial to provide some direction to the committees of what we would like to see reflected in that spend. And again, the March hearing is a first opportunity to do that.
So it isn't uncommon that pieces of legislation eventually cross paths.
Yeah.
And then become one. That is a possibility. Or they're two separate bills. But what's really critical here is the funding stream as well. So I think once again, regardless of how this ends up, meaning these pieces of legislation, the most important element here is ensuring that that money is not taken away from that budget. And the only way we can do that, I believe, is by having this type of conversation with Wade and giving him these options, and then him providing us feedback as to what potentially is the best route. And that's the route that we pursue. So I don't want to necessarily say one bill over another, but I will say though that let's put all these options on the table for Mr. Crowfoot and see where it leads us. With the goal of ensuring that the $68 million at the minimum comes our way.
Yeah, no, I agree. Obviously the description here is very short on the bills, and they do seem different enough, and I think the intent is well intended. It sounds like it's important for people to have a 3-day look ahead, and at the same time know what particular communities may be the ones that are most impacted by these events. And so, and you're right, the budget is what's the most key. Without the budget, you're not going to have anything. So
Director Cardenas has his hand raised.
go ahead,
Yeah,
Director.
I appreciate the discussion. I think Supervisor Perez hit the nail on the head in terms of tapping Mr. Secretary Crowfoot on the shoulder in regards to a caucus opportunity. And again, I'm just trying to determine if we're caucusing or canvassing here. I'm hoping, Mr. Patrick, you give the member agencies the opportunity to caucus as opposed to canvassing. But there's been some really healthy discussion that have taken place led by Supervisor Perez in terms of checking in with our secretary and determining a pathway here. I think at the same time, if we're looking for earmarks or a reappropriation, that we identify projects and initiatives that we believe will benefit local population. But we're going to get tapped on the shoulder too. We have a North Lake project with a fund balance, I believe, and they're probably going to ask us what we have done with those monies and how we have committed those monies. So if we're asking for a reappropriation here or establishing a new priority, I think we also need to be mindful that we do have monies for North Lake that have not been committed or have not been used. So just be prepared to have a reconciliation of your piggy banks and determine, what monies we have now and what monies we've committed and have done projects. So I think Supervisor Perez gave direction, and I will support that direction. And that is to have a conversation with Secretary Crowfoot regarding these initiatives. And I also just want to note that IAD has a pretty active state legislative committee, and I do need to canvass and caucus with them in terms of legislative priorities, state legislative priorities, to ensure that there is alignment. And so those are my comments. Thank you.
I agree. I think we're all in agreement that Patrick.
Does this require a motion, executive director or legal counsel, or is this an administrative action that can take place with direction?
I think directions to staff is sufficient.
Okay.
I don't hear any dissent to the direction that was given, and we can operate based on that.
Okay, good. All right.
Hey, folks,
Yeah.
while we're on this budget topic, I thought it might be helpful if I could jump in and provide a little bit of detail about what is in the budget proposal that we've put forward in the governor's budget. I missed last month's meeting, actually for a budget meeting that was happening internally. So wanted to take the opportunity to share with you all a little bit more detail. This is up on the Department of Finance's website, our full budget change proposal. So you guys can reference that for the detailed explanation of the $65 million request. But let me provide a little summary here that I hope will be, helpful to everyone. So the Salton Sea Management Program and the governor has proposed $65 million for the Salton Sea Management Program in this January budget. Of that $65 million, 60 is for new vegetation enhancement or aquatic projects for either their planning, advancing their design, or construction. And that's the next set of projects that are in the queue for our team to continue to get projects on the ground and expand the footprint of dust suppression and habitat that we have under construction now. In addition to the 60 million for planning or construction, we have 18 positions identified in the budget, split over 2 years. So I think it's 10 in the first year and then 8 in the following year. And those positions are to grow out the staffing of the Salton Sea Management Program that's really essential to be able to put projects on the ground and scale up the initial work we have on the north and south side of the sea. And it also includes in that of those 18 positions, 8 of them are for operations and maintenance. With the understanding that we have projects that are nearing completion and will need to be operated and maintained as they're completed. So just wanted to provide that brief summary here, if that's helpful for you all, and happy to answer questions or have further dialogue offline.
Thank you for that update. There's no other questions. We're going to move on to Desert Shores.
Mr. Chairman, I'm noting the time and I got to tap it 3 times, like Moses. I'm noting the time and I don't want to give anything its unjust due, but we do have an item on the agenda regarding the contract with GAFCON. And we do have a presentation from GAFCON. In the interest of what the presentation was simply an update of what they have done. It's considerable, their interactions with the community and the input that they've been giving to the project team. But because of their efforts, they've of course identified a broader scope of work that they need to accomplish under their feasibility component, which will take this project to a full underwriting with a budget and the ability to go out for bids for construction and design. So at the board's pleasure, we can have the presentation. Modification to the agreement. I think if I hover near this thing, it goes up.
So, Mr. O'Dowd, I would defer the presentation, and I hope that everybody is informed about the proposed change. But I did have 2 questions, and then I would make a motion to approve. One would be in regards to the test well and the actions with Bureau of Reclamation to proceed forward, and then also the soil testing on the channels to ensure that what is going to be needed to keep water in there if we reintroduce it.
Thank you, Supervisor Kelly. Those efforts will be covered under a separate scope of work by Geologic, and GAFCON is now working to refine that scope of work. They had a proposal to move that forward. They want to make sure that everything that needs to be covered in order to complete the entitlements is completed. So we should be looking at that within the next 4 to 6 weeks, hopefully by the next time I come. The other thing is we did not want to move forward on that until we had sufficient funding under the Bureau grant. There was enough money in the Bureau grant to move forward with what they identified as phase 1 of that scope, but not enough to complete phase 2. And GAFCON, I think rightly advised that we really shouldn't move forward until we've moved those dollars around and made sure we had the funding. In that regard, we are in the process of closing out a separate Bureau grant for the dredging project at North Lake, and we're hopeful. The Bureau hasn't made nor are they an ability to commit those funds to this project, but we're hopeful to be able to have some or all of those funds move to this project to ensure its success.
Okay, and so I know that we've had conversations with the Bureau and they've given us green light. USGS has been involved, made comment on the test well, doing a mud rig, also in comment about the soil and the testing parameters. And that was back in September. I'm just on the timing Is it dependent on GAFCON or are these independent with Bureau?
I think it's both, and they're both, for all intents and purposes, they're on a fast track to get accomplished. We need to get the funding reallocated, and part of that is going to be defining the revised scope of work from GAFCON. Mr. Normayalo from GAFCON is on the screen, and perhaps he can touch on that briefly.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, the statement of work that we're asking to change would be more specific on our deliverables that we're going to be providing to the authority, as well as the schedule for those deliverables.
I think he's asking, Norm, I think he's asking more specifically about the finalization of the geologic scope of work. What's it going to take to get that to the finish line?
I spoke to Geologics this morning. They're off-site in Tulare today. So I expect more movement by the time they get back home. For this case, it's Grass Valley. And so I expect something maybe by the end of next week. And this new scope of work will be directed directly to your office, Patrick, in lieu of going to the Imperial County Planning Department.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I motion to accept the proposal of change.
Your second?
Second.
It's a motion by Supervisor Kelly, second by Director Aguilar. We have roll call, please.
Vice President Estrada,
Yes.
Secretary Dockstader,
Aye.
Director Plancarte,
Plancarte, yes.
Director Kelly,
Yes.
Director Tortes,
Yes.
Director Aguilar,
Yes.
Director Cardenas,
Yes.
motion passed.
Thank you. Moving on now to other projects.
Only briefly on the North Lake project. The geological testing is substantially complete. We're expecting to be moving towards a revised budget. Hopefully by the next time this board gathers, we'll have some indication of what the revised cost of that project will be, and I'll report it at that time.
Thank you. Moving on to reports, and I'm going to let you, Patrick, tell us what reports we're going to hear.
Okay, Ms. Lehman is not available today. There is a written report in your packet. In addition to that, there are bulleted what we would call issues that outline our needs in addressing, I swear, I'm not touching it, addressing the core feasibility study. We need some additional help from Congress, and so that's in your packet. On the state side, Horacio, he gave an extensive presentation already. I know Mr. Miguel Hernandez is on the line, and I think that his report is important.
Thank you, Patrick, and members of the board. Just keep it brief. I have a brief update on Salton Sea Management Program, particularly on the Salton Sea Management Program and Community Needs Report. This report was released back in January, and it's out for public review for a 60-day comment period. Comment period closes on March 26th. And within this 60-day comment period, we're going to have 3 community meetings in March. So 2 of them will be in person. One is in the Mecca Community Center on March 13th during the evening, 5:30. Also, the second one will be at the West Shores High School on March 14th, the next day. And this is going to be also at 5:30. And then we're going to have a third meeting. This is going to be a virtual Zoom meeting, more of a webinar. And this is going to be the day after, which is March 15th. And we're going to have that on a webinar only option. So 3 meetings coming up mid-March to continue to get additional feedback and input for the community needs reports that are out. And you can find those on our website, saltonsea.ca.gov. Under the quick link section, you can find those documents there. And also, just real quick, the Community Engagement Committee met last week, and we had a really good update from our partners at the water boards regarding the annual Salton Sea workshop. So we have a date that's going to happen in May 22nd, and that's going to happen in Sacramento with options to join virtually So just to get that out there, again, the date is May 22nd. That's the annual Salton Sea workshop where the Salton Sea Management Program will provide its annual update and all the work and efforts that happen in 2023. And that concludes my report.
Mr. Hernandez. I do want to welcome and introduce Mr. Enrique Arroyo, who's the new district and superintendent for the Salton Sea Recreation Area, and invite him to share a few words if you'd like. Is he with us?
Thank you, Patrick, and members of the board. My name is Enrique Arroyo. I'm the district superintendent for Ocotillo Wells District, and we oversee the Salton Sea State Recreation Area. Lately, our attendance at Salton Sea has been up about 2,000 to 4,000 a month, a slight trend upward. Our visitor center remains open daily, and we're excited about that. Couple of noteworthy items. Our nonprofit partner, Parks California, provided a grant to a local group called Growers First to do a year-long weekly visit program for youth 7 to 18 years old to do bird watching at Salton Sea State Recreation Area. Another item of interest is in our department's effort to expand access. The department added Salton Sea State Recreation Area to its Adventure Pass program, which provides free access for fourth graders during their fourth grade year for fourth graders and their families. So that's a great opportunity for kids. Thank you for the opportunity to report, and I can address any board member questions.
Thank you, Mr. Arroyo. On the local front, we have Mr. Alan Pace here from the Salton Sea Action Committee.
Good afternoon. It's Salton Sea Action Committee continues to work on both in-person and virtual tours, and we've just been invited to be on the advisory committee for the Salton Sea Summit that will happen again this October, the UCR Salton Sea Task Force. That's all I've got.
Like it, short and sweet. As will my report be, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to report that next month I'm intending to bring before this board a first draft of next year's operating budget. One thing that will frame that budget, I swear I didn't touch it, at our last board meeting is the extension of the current agreement with the state regarding public relations, so hopefully we will be able to review that and finalize that, review it next month and finalize it in April and have a completed operating budget sufficient in time for the member agencies to consider it. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you. And with no more items on the agenda, this meeting is adjourned. How's everything going?